My friends, Bolivia has experienced probably the weirdest coup I have ever seen in history. Yes, for those of you who are watching and joining with us right now, on Wednesday, June 26th, just this past month, there was an attempted coup in Bolivia, where General Juan Jose Zuniga, who until the previous day had been the head of the Bolivian armed forces, he went and commanded a group of soldiers who, in armored vehicles, went and attacked the government palace, the center of political power in the country. The reason that this was done is that their supposed objective was to make Bolivia a, quote, true democracy. Though, of course, you know how when we've covered coups and varying things on this channel, that is rarely, if ever, the actual case. In the case of the general, though, on Tuesday the 25th, the previous day, Zuniga had been removed from his post for statements that were made against the former president, Evo Morales, in which he said that he would not allow Morales to be president of the country again, which you know is a rather extreme political statement to make by any military or even non-military figure for that matter. Only hours later, though, the military uprising was thwarted. It was stopped, and Zuniga was arrested. Thus, you would think everything is fixed, everything is good now, except no. At the very moment that he was arrested, the general would go and accuse the sitting Bolivian president, Luis Arce, of having actually asked him to organize a self-coup, that he asked the general to coup his own government, the reason being is that he was very unpopular and he wanted this action to be able to improve it. Because you know, if he can save the country, he can save his popularity. That is just so incredibly weird, and the world didn't really know how to react. The day would end with a clear condemnation of the coup by numerous political leaders on the international scene, but no one could really tell who was telling the truth at this point. If you're confused while watching this, I don't really blame you. The whole story behind why we even got here in the first place is extremely messy. The events that we're talking about here are part of an ongoing struggle within the MAS. This is the Movement Towards Socialism, which is the ruling party of Bolivia. The struggle that we're talking about is something that is between the former President Morales and Luis Arce, who is actually Morales' former Minister of the Economy. As for why that is happening in the first place, well, it is the former's desire to stand in the 2025 presidential election, despite there having already been a recent ruling by the Bolivian Constitutional Court, which stated that the presidential mandate can only be exercised for 2 periods, whether that is continuous or discontinuous. What that means is it does not matter if you were president once in the 90s and then once in the later 2000s, you had your chance, whether it was back-to-back or not. You only get 2 times. However, in the case of Morales, he has already governed not for 2 periods, but 3 periods already, between 2006 and 2009, from 2009 to 2014, and finally from 2014 to 2019. Arce was effectively his protege, and has been president since 2020. These 2 former friends want the same job, and one of them is trying to violate the law in order to be able to beat the other guy, and so his response then was to potentially do another illegal action in order to stop that one. You see why it gets extremely messy here. This is the really confusing thing. Within the main political party of the Bolivian left, supporters of either Morales and now those of Arce are in conflict, among the supporters of which apparently would be the General Juan Jose Zuniga. But whether or not the coup attempt was actually real or not, in the end, most Bolivians would say that it doesn't really matter, that they no longer believe what their leader actually has to say, that Arce would be better served addressing Bolivia's gasping economy and less time trying to pull a variety of different political stunts. As one Bolivian citizen would say on the matter, quote, he should think about Bolivia's economy, make a plan to move forward, find a way to get dollars, and to work to move Bolivia forward. No more of these childish self-coups. That kind of simmering anger amongst the populace has paved the way for even more strife in a country that, honestly, when you go back and look at its history, is no stranger to political unrest in the first place. The reason that I bring all this up, my friends, is that Bolivia is facing one of the worst economic and financial crises in its entire history. GDP growth is at its lowest level in 2 decades, with an economic recession, payment crises, high inflation, and high unemployment rates to boot. All of this is combined. The Bolivian central bank is also running out of foreign currency, particularly US dollars, which much of the Bolivian middle class relies on for any kind of real financial stability and market predictability. Combine this with recent scandals in Bolivia's energy production, including long-term shortages of natural gas and electricity in remote areas, And this just increases the turmoil around a country that is entirely dependent upon the government but has simultaneously no faith in it. The economic issue that we are talking about here is something that is a key part in the outbreak of the current Bolivian political crises, which, as we shall see, does not seem to have really any real prospects of a quick solution coming in and fixing things. In fact, and here's the wild part that you're going to want to stick around for, a solution itself might not even be coming from Bolivia or other places within South America or really even the United States, but rather China, which has been gradually increasing its presence in the South American country over the past decade or so. But okay, we're going to be addressing that here in a bit, and the question of course becomes, how did we get here? And what is going to be happening next? Well, my friends, let's go ahead and talk about it, because this is a problem. This is something that has been brewing for many decades, and now we are seeing it begin to boil over.
But my friends, before we continue on with today's history lesson, I would just like to share with you all a little bit of my own history with today's sponsor, MyHeritage. For those of you who are unfamiliar, MyHeritage is the #1 family history service that is around. There is literally nothing else that is capable of doing what MyHeritage does to the scale that it does, with billions of family records that are able to help you locate and find out more about yourself and your family. The way that it works is very simple. After putting in the information of yourself as well as your close family members, MyHeritage will automatically link you up with possible family matches that you're able to confirm. This will instantly build out a family tree for you that you're able to track, and along with this, they have features like instant discoveries. While it is that you're going through your everyday life, MyHeritage will constantly be sorting through varying different documents, matches that other people have made, and from there, connecting you with people from your past that you never knew that you were related to. As an example, here I've been presented with an instant discovery that is going to confirm 40 new family members from my mother's side that connect me all the way back into Denmark and other parts of Scandinavia. This is insane and adds cousins to my family tree that I never knew actually ever existed. On top of all that, it's more than simply finding names. MyHeritage will also find documents from old family photos that I never knew existed. Like, look at this relative from literally 5 generations ago. I gotta pull the mic away. Do you see it? No. What about if I animate the photo? Something that MyHeritage allows me to do, which is like bringing the dead back to life. Oh my god. Considering everything that I do when talking about history on this channel, this is easily one of the coolest things that I've possibly seen. And I really hope that you all think so too. So make sure to go ahead and click my link down in the description and get yourself a 2-week free trial of MyHeritage. I am genuinely curious out there, considering everything that I've discovered with 40 new relatives in here, if I still have some relatives that are out there in Europe now that potentially can find me. Give it a shot yourself. I'm genuinely curious to see if any of you are related to me.
The context of all of this is quite messy. Bolivia is a land of sharp physical and social contrasts. Although it has been blessed with enormous mineral wealth, Bolivia was, and still is to this day, one of the poorest nations in Latin America, and has effectively been described as a beggar that sits on a throne of gold. That is quite a harsh term to be labeled with, but honestly, when you look at its economy, its history, and how it is that the state functions, it kind of does make sense. You see, Bolivia's terrain and people are extremely diverse. Going back in the 1960s, Bolivian society was predominantly rural and Indian, unlike the rest of South America. There really hadn't been nearly as much Spanish colonization of Bolivia itself. The population there, or rather the geography, wasn't very likable to many of the Spanish. The Indian peoples, primarily Quechua or Aymara, would make up between 50 to 70% of the population. The remaining parts of the population were either white or mixed races called mestizos. This native tribal history is something that we are going to have to touch upon here because it is a key factor that leads into the problems that Bolivia has today. When we talk about history here, the Indian groups that we just mentioned had hundreds of years ago formed their own great kingdoms, the Aymara and the Inca, which the Inca are the Quechua for anyone who is wondering. That's their actual name, though we would eventually in history call them the Incan Empire. The Spanish conquest led by Francisco Pizarro had began in 1526, and this is what would eventually end the Inca that had come to dominate much of South America. A new colony that was created as part of these conquests was called Upper Peru, this being Bolivia. This is something that, over the course of its existence, was a fairly neglected part of the Inca Empire. And under the Spanish, this is something that would continue through its colonial rule. That being until the year 1545, when large silver deposits were found at Potosi, nearly 13,800 feet above sea level. Now, for anyone who is familiar with things in history and how the Spanish functioned when it came to gold, silver, and other precious metals, well, they were all about that. This discovery would transform this high-altitude backwater into what was easily the wealthiest part of the Spanish Empire. empire. I mean, we are talking a ludicrous amount of wealth here. Although the Spanish crown would receive around 20% of the silver that was extracted, it would fuel the entire region's economy. The remote location of Potosi meant that every single thing, whether it was food, tools, animals, labor, all of this, with just how incredibly high altitude it was, all of this had to be imported. And that is a problem that still remains to this day in Bolivia 500 years later. Almost every single thing in the country has to be imported. But more on that later. In 1548, the town of La Paz was established on the trade route between the silver mines and the colonial capital at Lima, Peru. By the year 1650, Potosi was the largest city in South America, having between 120,000 to 160,000 people, at a time when London had around 400,000 people itself. It was an absolutely massive city, especially for a place like in South America with as remote of a region as it was, and the entire thing was fueled by silver extraction. Silver extraction, which became the principal source of Spanish royal wealth for almost 300 years. Looking at the situation, it makes one then wonder, okay, well, how does the wealthiest part of the entire Spanish Empire become one of the poorest states today? Well, my friends, during the 300 years of colonial rule, Spain would gradually impose its political and social institutions on a predominantly extractive economy, something that entirely focused on mineral exports. The first of this was silver, and then eventually it would transition over to things like tin, all of which would use Indian forced labor, something that is still actually relevant to the economy of Bolivia today. Eventually, though, after these 300-odd years, Bolivia would gain its independence in 1825. But that wasn't going to make things easier. Bolivia's history was instead marked with many years of political and territorial insecurity. In fact, honestly, one could say when we're talking about this, that things were so frequently unstable that the only constant thing that you had about Bolivian history during the 18th and 19th century was that things were unstable. Like, the only stable and guaranteed thing was that Bolivia was going to be unstable. That's it. This would in turn mean that Bolivia's future was constantly going to be marred by political turmoil and military defeats, things that would lead to many of the problems that Bolivia has to this day, which we're going to be listing. As an example, in 1867, Bolivia would lose territory in the north to Brazil. Only around a decade later, during the War of the Pacific, which was from 1879 to 1883, Bolivia would go and ally with Peru against Chile and fight another war. This clash was something that was prompted by economics over a very unlikely source of revenue, that being guano. Yes, my friends, the nations actually went to war over poop, which is a very real thing for anyone who's confused. Guano is actually extremely nitrate rich and is something that is a very valuable tool when utilized for things like gunpowder or fertilizer and other things. Despite being ganged up on by two different nations, Chile would prevail on both land and sea, and would occupy the Peruvian capital of Lima. Bolivia itself would take a huge blow in its national pride and lose areas that were rich in natural resources. But more significantly than anything else, Bolivia simultaneously would lose access to the Pacific Ocean, which would make it a landlocked country, one of only two in South America, with the other one being Paraguay. This is arguably one of the most relevant points for the entirety of Bolivian history. The issue truly becomes that in the modern day and age, if you do not have access to the sea, if you cannot engage in international trade through your own controlled port, this means that your potential growth is going to be severely stunted. And that's kind of what would happen with Bolivia. But at least from 1884 until the 1930s, Bolivia would enjoy relative stability. The economy would even take a jump, as tin would replace silver as the major export of the nation. World demand would foster the expansion of railways to transport tin to the United States and Europe. It is during this time that Bolivian intellectuals would blame Chile for its defeat in the War of the Pacific and would do everything possible to try and modernize the country in order to make sure that something like that couldn't happen again. Even rival political parties would work effectively together for political and economic modernization. The politicians in government, which were largely elected by a small but literate and Spanish-speaking electorate, would reorganize, re-equip itself, and professionalize the disgraced armed forces. From this, it actually would provide a degree of stability and prosperity going into the next century. However, moving on rapidly from that, the 20th century saw three major events that drastically changed things for Bolivia: the Chaco War, World War II, and the 1952 Revolution. The Chaco War was the last territorial loss for the country, but more importantly, it heavily politicized an entire generation, both politically and militarily, to seek change. World War II and the need for tin would keep the economy surging forward and focus on extraction, and the 1952 Bolivian Revolution would cause drastic political, social, and economic changes. Most importantly, though, universal suffrage would promise the majority Indian population more voice in the government, and massive land reform was decreed in order to improve life for the poor. Now, initially, the government under the control of the MNR would garner multi-class support. The people were really behind them. But with time, rampant inflation and declining farm productivity, resulting from inadequate capital investment in agriculture, would hold back economic growth quite severely. This, in turn, would begin to lead to greater political instability. In 1964, Paz Estenssoro would run for and win re-election, only to end up being deposed by armed forces that were concerned over the threat of Cuban-style revolutionary violence in the Andes. Because, of course, my friends, anyone knows that the thing that truly makes a nation stable is military takeovers of the government. Yeah, you can probably see where this is going. The army take over the government in 1964 would usher in a prolonged period of authoritarian military rule. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, successive military governments would focus on maintaining internal order, modernizing the mining sector, and vigorously defending Bolivian sovereignty. From this, the Bolivian state would espouse a program of revolutionary nationalism, with the idea being put forth by some military members that there was a revolutionary mandate of the armed forces, something in which the only way that people were going to be able to end Bolivia's underdevelopment was to allow and encourage the military to manage the economy and intervene in domestic politics. Something which, again, for anyone who has seen any of my stuff covering nations in their history, you can probably guess where there's going to be some problems. The 1970s, then, were completely dominated by the figure of General Hugo Banzer, who was president from 1971 to 1978. During its first few years, Banzer's populist military government actually did enjoy the support of the MNR, and would, during this time, oversee rapid economic growth, something that was largely driven by heavy demand for Bolivia's commodity exports. That was not going to last, though, and by 1974, the governing coalition had splintered, with labor unrest intensifying over time as the economy experienced a severe slowdown. Does that mean that the military is going to back off and allow for civilian rule, though? No, of course not. Why would you ever think that? No, instead, the military regime was going to resort to greater repression in order to be able to maintain political control. Because of course. That being said, however, in the late 1970s, Bolivia's military regime would come under pressure from the United States and Europe to liberalize and restore civilian democratic rule. With international pressure and opposition from civilian groups mounting, General Banzer would announce a presidential election for the year 1980. However, when this happened, as you could probably guess would happen with the military rule, two subsequent coups in the midst of congressional and presidential elections ended up delaying the transition schedule a little bit. It wasn't until September of 1982 that the military would finally hand over the government control to a civilian administration, something that was led by Hernan C.S. Suazo, who was president from 1982 to 1985. This person being a member of the Democratic and Popular Unity Coalition. So okay, we finally get rid of military rule, we have a civilian administration that is in charge, everything should be better for Bolivia now, right? No. In fact, you could almost say that it gets worse. You see, my friends, in the early 1980s, Bolivia would face the most severe economic crisis of the preceding 3 decades. The economy was completely tarnished by chronic balance of payment and fiscal deficits, and a foreign debt of nearly $3 billion. Now, to some of you who've probably looked and seen what I've covered many different things for economies in the past, that doesn't really sound so bad, and then you remember in like the year 1980 that Bolivia's entire GDP was only around $4.5 billion. So that debt of $3 billion was really, really bad. The Suazo government attempted to address Bolivia's economic crisis by negotiating several tentative stabilization programs with the International Monetary Fund. However, during the first half of 1985, the international tin market would collapse, which, if you remember that is literally the #1 export of Bolivia, that's going to lead to some problems. Bolivia's inflation would end up reaching an annual rate of more than 24,000%. As the crisis would intensify over time, the opposition would eventually force Suazo to give up power through a new round of elections that would be held in July of 1985. What happens next in this absolute crapshoot, you may wonder? Well, the 1985 presidential race was a head-to-head contest between the former military dictator Banzer and the MNR founder Paz Estenssoro. After managing to lure the left-wing movement of the revolutionary left with promises of state patronage, Paz Estenssoro would end up being elected president of Bolivia for the fourth time since 1952, which is really big, but then he would immediately afterwards abandon his left-wing allies and would launch one of the most severe austere economic stabilization packages that had ever been implemented in Latin America. So basically, not only did he not fulfill his campaign promises, but he did the exact opposite of them. Hailed as the new economic policy, the Nueva Política Económica, the decree would aim at ending Bolivia's record-setting hyperinflation and dismantling many of the large and very inefficient state enterprises that had been created by the revolution back in the 1950s. For anyone who has seen on this channel when we've talked about state-owned enterprises and how usually corrupt and inefficient they tend to be, this is the problem that we're talking about here. Although this program was successful in ending hyperinflation, the NPE would bring about a sharp reduction in real wages for workers and would temporarily increase the country's already very high levels of poverty, which, as you can imagine, did not make him very popular. Still though, in order to maintain his rule, Paz Estenssoro and Banzer would end up actually negotiating a formal power-sharing agreement, something that was called the Pact for Democracy, which would create a mechanism to overcome the fragmentation of the political party system and allow the government to push forward with its austerity measures. This is going to sound like a really weird example and probably make no sense, but I want you to imagine if, say, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders ended up winning with zero support of either Democrats or Republicans, and then they combined forces to be able to actually pass laws. It's that weird of a mix. This pact would play an important role in resolving other political impasses that would take place during the 1989 and 1993 presidential elections, in which, as you can probably guess from the confusion that was happening in the country, not a single candidate could ever actually claim a majority of the vote. There was no actual winner. Instead, the government would have to function through a series of weird coalitions, with one of these being the government of President Jaime Paz Zamora, who would provide continuity with the market reform policies of his predecessor and would oversee a modest economic recovery, something that was aided by a rebound in the tin market and the discovery of vast resources of natural gas. And that last part, my friends, that is extremely important leading into the modern day, as natural gas would become one of the cornerstones of the Bolivian economy, and simultaneously one of its biggest curses. And we'll get to that. But first, the 1993 presidential election would see Paz Estenssoro's former planning minister and prominent businessman Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada receive a plurality of the vote on the MNR ticket. Sanchez de Lozada would represent a new generation of MNR leaders that were firmly committed to the modernization of Bolivia with the aid of private capital investment from abroad. In a policy known as capitalization, private capital and expertise were attracted to the hydrocarbon sector, something that was growing rapidly with the discovery of natural gas fields. In exchange for a 30-year operating contract, foreign investors would double the capital of state energy companies and would embark on an aggressive gas exploration mission. As a consequence of renewed investment, known natural gas reserves would increase almost five-fold by the year 2000. They would discover 5 times the amount that they initially thought that they had, and the Bolivian state was receiving more than $500 million per year in royalties. Mind you, the economy of Bolivia in the year 2000 was only like $8 billion, meaning that $500 million a year in royalties is a huge percentage of that. This whole thing was massive. The economy and the country were practically saved. The discovery of this gas and the exploitation of its resources was massive. Effectively, the economy and country were practically saved, which is great. And so what does the state then do with that money? Well, they spent it all, of course, but we're going to be talking about that here in a second. The 1997 elections would then see the return of Hugo Banzer to the presidency, but this time, not actually part of the military. No, he was no longer a military dictator. Instead, he was just a civilian. Despite his campaign promises to halt privatization, Banzer would continue most of the economic policies of his predecessor. The retired general would also embark on a campaign to halt the illicit export of coca, which was the primary ingredient of cocaine, and at this time a very severe concern in the United States. Coca farming, for anyone who is curious, is something something that has existed in parts of Bolivia since ancient Inca times. But this would take on an increased importance and spread to new areas of the country as the international drug trade would expand over the course of the 1980s and 90s. Pressure from the United States to curb coca production would then lead to Banzer's administration implementing the Dignity Plan, this being an aggressive program of crop eradication by the Bolivian armed forces. Yeah, that's right. The military itself was going out and destroying farmers' plants. Although this was temporarily successful in its limited aims of eradicating coca fields, the Dignity Plan would simultaneously increase rural poverty, because, people's crops were being destroyed, and they had grown these as a kind of cash crop in order to live. This would spark a new generation of social protest movements among the largely indigenous coca farmers, called cocaleros, of the Chapare region. And that would not be the only thing that this guy would do to piss people off. In April of 2000, Hugo Banzer would sign a contract with Aguas del Tunari, this being a private consortium to operate and improve the water supply in Bolivia's third largest city of Cochabamba. However, shortly after this happened, the company would go and triple the rate of water in the city, something which would result in protests and rioting among people who could no longer afford access to clean water. Amidst Bolivia's nationwide economic collapse and growing national unrest over the state of the economy, the Bolivian government was eventually forced to withdraw the water contract. If over the course of this video, as you've been watching so far, it doesn't sound like things are getting any better for Bolivia, yeah, that's kind of how its history unfortunately goes. As all of this was happening, new social movements founded on regionalism and ethnic identity would emerge as a major force in Bolivian politics during the later part of the Banzer administration. The discovery of vast reserves of natural gas in the late 1990s had provoked a very conversation and controversy over who actually owns the natural resources in the country and to what extent Bolivia should actually pursue neoliberal economic policies that are favorable to foreign capital investment. In other words, the issue would pit different parts of the nation against each other, as the natural gas-rich eastern province of Santa Cruz would fight against the social movements that drew much of their support from the poorer communities of central and western Bolivia that did not have access to nearly as many resources. On top of all of that, you would see an intense period of conflict between the social movements and the government, which would limit the latter's ability to actually implement any of its policies that it needed to govern the country. During 2002 and 2003, the government was increasingly challenged by disruptive activities of these varying different social movements. In September of 2003, violent protests would erupt in response to the government's plan to institute an income tax and to export liquefied natural gas to the United States by means of a pipeline that would go through Chile. If you're wondering how severe this is, approximately 80 demonstrators ended up being killed in clashes with troops that were deployed to break up blockades of the highways. In October, mobs from the nearby shantytown of El Alto would occupy and sack government buildings in La Paz. This got so bad that in order to quell the violence, the president, Sanchez de Lozada, had to resign and hand over the government to Vice President Carlos Mesa Gisbert, which sort of worked. Mesa's appointment as president would temporarily ease the crisis, but it didn't actually do anything to resolve the dispute between supporters and opponents of foreign corporate roles in, what happens with the extraction and sale of natural gas within the country. Mesa would attempt to defuse the crisis by submitting the gas question to the public in a national referendum, and the July 2004 referendum would hand Mesa a tactical victory by approving the export of gas, albeit under greater state control than had originally been anticipated. It wasn't going to be as liberal and open as had been desired. Still though, a compromise can be seen as a win, but despite this somewhat promising start, Mesa's administration would be brought down in June of 2005 by a new wave of road blockades and large-scale protests in La Paz. Bolivia just cannot catch a break here. With the threat of a violent escalation looming, as well as a talk of secession by the eastern provinces, Congress would eventually agree on Eduardo Rodriguez Beltze, who was then serving as president of the Supreme Court, to be appointed as interim president in the meantime. Sworn in on June 10th of 2005, Rodriguez would immediately call for a special national election in December of 2005. Now, My friends, for those of you who have stuck around with me this long, thank you very much. If you could go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, do anything you can to help support me and the videos that I make here, I would appreciate it. I know that we've gone through a lot of background here, but you have to understand that for the story that we're talking about here, Bolivia is just a series of economic and political crises back to back to back to back. All of these feed into the next, and this point that we are talking about here, 2005, this is the point where our story really begins for why we are where we are in the modern day. See, the December 2005 elections were widely anticipated as an opportunity for Bolivians to finally end the crisis of governance, of actually having a president and a government that would, function. The presidential election became a contest between two candidates. You had Evo Morales of the leftist MAS and former President George Tuto Quiroga of the conservative Social Democratic Power Coalition. Despite concerns that neither candidate was ever going to actually win with a clear majority, that didn't happen. Morales ended up being elected with 53.7% of the vote, becoming the first president of Indian ethnicity in Bolivia's entire history, as well as, mind you, the first majority president since the revolution. Yes, that's right. Since the 1950s, there had not been a single government that enjoyed more than 50% support within Bolivia. This was a big start, but no one really knew what was going to happen. In early 2006, the Morales administration's prospects for addressing all of the different challenges and issues that Bolivia was facing, no one knew whether or not they were going to actually be able to do anything. Bolivia remained deeply divided by contending ethnic, class, and regional loyalties, things that would severely test the new administration's capacity to try and build a national consensus on what actually could be done, whether economically, politically, socially, everything. And that is where the real modern day economic issues begins. For the context of what we're talking about here, one needs to understand that a leftist government has been put in charge, something which typically, historically, likes to invest in the population, infrastructure, social programs, in order to be able to help the population and also be able to maintain their own political authority. In the case of Bolivia, gas prices would double to record highs in the year 2006. This would allow Bolivia to accumulate the largest foreign reserves in its entire history. These would rise from 12% of GDP in 2003 to 52% by 2012, a massive jump. Real GDP per person during this period would grow by 50%. And according to the World Bank, the proportion of people who were living on the equivalent of less than $2.15 per day, severe poverty, this would fall from 15% in 2005 to 2% by 2019. These were huge jumps in social progress, and all across the world, varying different peoples were praising Bolivia's economic miracle. But problem was, like many things that we have covered in here, it was not sustainable. The government would end up spending much of their windfall and economic reserves from natural gas on fuel subsidies, inefficient state firms, and also propping up the exchange rate in order to allow the Bolivian currency to be stronger on the international market. In order to understand what it is that I mean, keep this in mind. Fuel prices in Bolivia were frozen from 2005 all the way through 2023. So at a time when the market was rapidly changing, fuel in Bolivia was still 54 cents per liter compared to the global average of 1.31 in 2003. A huge difference that the government had to make up. How are they going to do this, mind you? Well, in 2006, Mr. Morales would nationalize the country's vast gas fields. Private companies were forced to sign new contracts with the state firm YPFB and were also required to hand over majority control to the state. They also had to pay royalties amounting to 50% of gross production. This was huge. The state would end up taking a bigger share of revenue from oil and gas companies than in any other state in Latin America besides Mexico. As one could probably guess would happen in this scenario, such statist populist policies did two kinds of things. One, it did provide an immediate amount of money that could be used in order to fund welfare programs, but it also severely inhibited investment. In 1999, after the country's energy sector had been privatized, annual net inflows of foreign direct investment as a share of GDP had hit a peak of 12%. But after Morales ended up taking charge, it would end up dropping to around 0.1%. Not even a full percentage point. It would just drop that much because companies did not see any reason to invest in a place that was taking the majority of their profits. So it is then that production effectively stagnated. But hey, that's not going to be a real problem or anything unless the global price of gas suddenly drops. Oh wait, no, it does. In 2014, the price of gas would crash, and with this, production would drop even lower. Annual investment in gas fields would then decline from over $1 billion in 2015 to only $300 million this last year. To the government, though, this didn't really matter. These were the things that were allowing them to maintain their popularity through the funding of their own welfare programs. And they refused to adjust their policies when gas prices fell. Instead, the government of Bolivia would pile on debts and use its reserves in order to fund its expensive subsidies. Public debt would double since 2014 to a whopping 80% of GDP, which is well above the regional and world average and also dangerously high for a lower middle income country. For anyone who is confused as to what I mean, Bolivia has run persistent and large fiscal deficits for a decade, something which has only allowed these debts to pile up. The situation would also lead to a significant reduction in the country's international reserves, which, if you look back in the year 2012, had been around $12 billion. Quite a large amount. The current reserves, though, sit around 1.7 or $1.8 billion, which is about 1/10 of what it was a decade ago. This is already not good, but the greater problem with this is that the majority of this 1.7 or $1.8 billion, that's not actually liquid cash. They can't just use that. That is gold. That is gold that is reserved within the country and the government doesn't want to get rid of. In February of 2023, the government would pass laws that would encourage farmers and gold cooperatives to sell it dollars by offering them a better exchange rate. The whole idea was for the government to be able to secure foreign currency without actually letting people know that anything was wrong, but that didn't exactly work. People would end up getting scared and would start to think, okay, why is the central bank trying to buy dollars? And what does that mean about our own currency, the Boliviano? As one money changer in La Paz, the capital, would say, he used to buy $3,000 a day and would sell half of that. But today, he can't even get $500. Bolivians are taking out their savings, they're swapping them for dollars, and they're stashing them at home. They're no longer giving it to the bank because they simply can't trust it. Another money changer would go on to say that when the dollars simply ran out, customers tried to buy up alternatives. Euros, Brazilian reals, Peruvian soles, Chilean pesos, anything. But now the government is running out of those too. Every kind of foreign currency was disappearing at a rapid rate. The crazy thing is, though, the government still to this day denies that there is any kind of problem. On April 11th, 2023, Luis Arce, the president and formerly Mr. Morales' finance minister, he gave a very rare interview in which he outright said there is no need to devalue the Boliviano or to remove subsidies. And when asked about the government's very optimistic growth projections for the year, which, mind you, were over double what the IMF said was probably going to happen, he replied, and I quote, "We are going to disappoint the international organizations again. I am reassured when they say we are going to fail because that means we are going to grow more." Which, as we would come to know, was simply wishful thinking. Only a day earlier, Mr. Arce had met with the private sector for the first time since coming to power in 2020 because simply the government couldn't do anything. Rather than inspire hope, the meeting instead suggests that things are bad, as he now has to turn to the private sector to actually get help. One of the key issues with all of this is that because of Bolivia's fixed exchange rate, something that I talked about before if you saw my video on Egypt, the central bank has been forced to defend its peg of just under 7 Bolivianos per US dollar by selling foreign currency. But with reserves now so meager, concerns are growing that its peg to the US dollar will have to be abandoned, which would in turn trigger a substantial devaluation. With the majority of ordinary Bolivians hugely reliant on imported necessities, such as food and fuel, this kind of depreciation would be catastrophic. It would send inflation skyrocketing and completely remove products off the shelf all across the country. Still though, the government was going to try to do whatever it could. The banking system would support the demand for dollars throughout much of 2023 by charging around 10% in commissions on dollar transfer overseas. But the depletion of reserves would be so severe that foreign exchange rationing had to be introduced, which would prompt lenders to place tighter restrictions on foreign exchange withdrawals. This would in turn force bank commissioners even higher and create more frequent delays in foreign exchange authorizations, whether that be for imports, for exports, or anything, which in turn would lead to more persistent fuel shortages and product shortages across the country. As one could imagine, the reserve shortfall would ultimately lead to a parallel exchange rate market emerging, something which would trade well above the official pegged rate, as people understood that it was not real. The situation that we're talking about here is something that has only been further exacerbated by long-term problems of waning natural gas reserves across Bolivia. Remember, all of this was dependent upon their natural gas and extraction in the first place, but it has experienced a steady decline over the years, and exports have fallen drastically in the last decade. In a report by the central bank, one of the key problems in the country's dwindling exchange reserves is the fact that its hydrocarbon exports have drastically dropped, meaning less foreign currency is coming into the country to buy Bolivian resources, which means less cash to be able to utilize to buy other goods. As such, crude oil imports have dramatically risen, while gas exports to neighboring countries like Argentina are expected to stop before the end of this year. Already, dollar scarcity is bad among importers who struggle to find hard currency to buy goods from abroad. These problems can get significantly worse as the government limits access to foreign currency. According to Monica de Boll, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, signs of a looming balance of payment crisis are everywhere. What she is talking about is that the scarcity of dollars has, as an example, already led to a scarcity of medications being available in the country. This being along with medical supplies, equipment for farming, mining, anything that you can think of, they don't actually have the ability to buy anymore. Bolivians are expressing growing frustrations. And worryingly enough, the real crisis has not actually begun yet. It has not reached yet Venezuela or Egypt levels of bad. And why is that, you may wonder? Well, usually it is because a country is being supported by an outside power, but the United States has not actually done much to assist with these issues. Instead, the real international contender that is stepping up to the plate and helping out Bolivia has been China. You see, my friends, China has been providing assistance for Bolivia to get through other crises in the recent past, including the COVID-19 pandemic, where Beijing had gifted millions of vaccine doses to the country's population. While it is possible that China's financial support and strategic investments will bail Bolivia out of the worst part of its economic crisis, simultaneously, China stands to gain the most from this partnership, as it will shift the South American country's economic dependence away from the United States and onto itself. You see, as Bolivia's $15 billion in international reserves from the early 2010s had dwindled to less than $2 billion, China would provide Bolivia with increasing sums of yuan, its own currency. Bolivia is now actually able to use Chinese currency for trade settlement purposes, allowing it to effectively de-dollarize its trade and escape the worst effects of its economic crisis. Without it, things would be significantly worse. To that point, around 10% of Bolivia's trade is now actually done in yuan. And they're not alone in this matter. Other countries such as Brazil and Saudi Arabia, as I have previously mentioned, they have also been trying to de-dollarize their economy, something which would reduce their dependency on US-led markets and diversify their economic and financial profile. This is big, but at the point that we're talking about this now, it is not enough to stop the dollar crisis, mind you. It just at least softens the effects of it. Through the Forum of China and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the China-CELAC Forum, Bolivia has become a growing partner to China in a region that previously was dominated by the United States. With this year marking the 10th anniversary of the China-CELAC Forum, talks between Beijing and La Paz have been more significant and more frequent. In late April of this year, 2024 as an example, Bolivia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Celida Sosa Lunda, would visit China to discuss growing their trade and economic partnership. At the meeting in Beijing, Sosa Lunda and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi would discuss the possibility of Bolivia's entry into the BRICS bloc of nations. They would reinforce their stand against US, quote, hegemony and bullying, while tentatively discussing infrastructure investment under the Belt and Road Initiative. For many US foreign policymakers, this is a scary subject, as Bolivia was once part of America's backyard, so to speak. However, over the past several decades, since the early 2000s, US trade and assistance has been on a steady decline. Meanwhile, China has now overtaken the US as Bolivia's main trading partner at a rate of about 5-to-1. That is right. China now trades 5 times as much as Bolivia does with the United States. In the face of economic and financial disaster, China has also provided Bolivia with greater loans and investment. In the last year alone, China would sign a deal for $1.4 billion to have a consortium of 3 Chinese state-owned companies extract Bolivian lithium through a variety of industrial plants. This is incredibly valuable to China, as lithium is a substance that Chinese battery and tech companies desperately need. And Bolivia, as it turns out, boasts the world's single largest reserves of lithium. A $350 million loan from the Export-Import Bank of China, repayable over 20 years at an interest rate of 2%, would also allow Bolivia to build a zinc refining plant, with zinc becoming one of Bolivia's main exports. Despite slowing production and logistical problems with energy exports, these programs from China have helped Bolivia actually face its economic slump and survive. It has mitigated what could be severely worse effects. With these currency loans and investment loans, China is now Bolivia's main source of foreign credit, though it still overall represents a small part of their external debt. Bolivia's Yuan reserves are also growing, both nominally as well as a share of its total foreign currency reserves. The Yuan, as it stands, is now the fastest growing currency in the Bolivian central bank foreign reserves. A number of Bolivian consumers and business owners are instead choosing to use the yuan over the dollar in order to conduct business and trade, with President Luis Arce's government, like other South American governments, seeing this as a alternative option to the crisis of dollar liquidity. This is a very interesting thing to look at. This timely support from China will likely push Bolivia further and further into an alternative regional order, where South American states, led by left-leaning governments, are relying on China instead of the United States for assistance and partnership. Arce would actually reinforce this idea himself in an interview with the CGTN America, a Chinese state-controlled outlet that would state that, quote, China comes from a popular government, one that cares about its people, and that Bolivia is part of a group of, quote, many countries that are trying to make a different world, a more equal world, and more justice in the world, which are very big words, and in terms of foreign policy could have massive shifts in the future, but as it stands, the government and the economy are still dependent upon dollars. As I said, the Chinese yuan is only around 10% of what is in Bolivia today, with the dollar still having overwhelming dominance, and the shortage of dollars has led to the emergence of a black market, with many sellers bringing in greenbacks from neighboring Peru and Chile and selling them at severely gouged prices. These gouged prices have trickled down into everything. People have stopped buying shoes, meat, clothing, any kind of item that you can think of that might be a necessity, they simply can't afford, and they only get what is absolutely needed. It has largely pushed working class people deeper and deeper into poverty. The little cash that they have is in turn stored at home, with many Bolivians making jokes that they have mattress banks. They store their cash at home because they simply cannot trust the actual banks of the government anymore. The entire thing that we're talking about here is a very complicated economic bind that has very few short-term solutions. It's not something that can easily be fixed. But the entire time that all this is happening, Arce still insists that Bolivia's economy is, quote, one of the most stable, and says that he is taking action to address problems that are ailing Bolivians, including shortages of dollars and gasoline. He would also say that the government was industrializing and investing in new economic factors such as tourism and lithium. The thing about this, as I previously mentioned, is that while Bolivia sits on the world's biggest stores of lithium, which is a very high-value metal that is needed to transition to a green economy, investment is only viable in the long term. Meanwhile, inflation has largely outpaced economic growth, and most Bolivians face unstable work conditions with minuscule pay. That, in turn, is only going to get worse and compounded by ongoing fights between Arce and Morales, who returned from exile after resigning during unrest in 2019, which Morales maintains was actually a coup against him. Now, the former allies have slung insults and fought over who will actually present their Movement for Socialism party ahead of the 2025 elections. Broad discontent has fueled waves of protests and strikes in recent months. Protests and roadblocks have dealt further economic blows, as customers all over the country generally do not travel anymore to buy products, which in turn just hurts more local economies. The government has tried to do something about this, but Morales, who still wields a great deal of power in Bolivia, would block Arce's government from passing measures in Congress to try to ease the economic turmoil. Which in turn brings us back to the situation of the coup attempt that started this video in the first place. Morales has fueled speculation that the military assault on the government palace, allegedly led by former military commander Jose Zuniga, was instead just a political stunt that was organized by Arce in order to gain sympathy from Bolivians. After all, this claim was first made by Zuniga himself when he was arrested. As Morales would say in a Sunday radio program about the matter, quote, "He tricked and lied to not just the Bolivian people, but the entire world." The political spats that we're talking about here have caused the majority of people to lose faith in their government, with many shaking their heads as they wait for hours, sometimes days, in lines to get diesel and gasoline because of intermittent shortages caused by lack of foreign currency. This is only going to get worse, as the country, which has relied for years on the international trade of natural gas as one of the main pillars of its economy, would see the revenue from this particular sector fall by 18% in the first 5 months of 2024. Minerals, which represent 49% of Bolivia's exports, the entirety of their exports, would also fall by 31%. And agricultural exports would decrease by 15% due to lower production and variations in international prices. All across the board, the country, the economy, its politics, everything seems to be failing. And as for what is going to actually happen to Bolivia, we do not know. But considering the race for influence in Asia and Africa between the US and China, this country could become the next battleground for political influence within the world. But that is where we're going to leave things here today. My friends, this has been Stakui with another History of Everything podcast YouTube episode. Thank you all very much for watching. I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe, and please let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should do next. I have a couple of other videos that I'm going to be doing, and I know one of these that we're going to be doing is going to be the one that is on the Taliban weaponizing water. Yes, that is going to be a thing that we're going to do. I know the vote. I've just been so busy with my travel and everything else that I've been doing. I would also, in the end, once more like to thank MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. If it wasn't for things like MyHeritage, I wouldn't be able to create the content that I do, because there is no guarantee that the YouTube gods are going to ever actually look kindly upon geopolitical videos. Make sure to check them out in my description below, and I will see you all next time. Thank you, my friends, and goodbye.